Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new episode of the Human Energy Field. As always, I'm your host Henry here with my co-host Jamie. Thank you for listening again. Hope you've enjoyed the previous episodes. We have just finished a Changeling the Dreaming campaign, and it's about time for us to talk about something in the world of darkness other than vampire. So we figured before we get into the film section, where we will be discussing the 1999 supernatural drama Bringing Out the Dead, starring our favourite jazz musician Nicolas Cage. And right at the end of the episode as well, we will be discussing our Warhammer project, so stick around until the end. You can hear us talk about updates with Forges of Nothos. In the meantime, we've got some books and RPGs to talk to you about as always. Let's get into it.
Let's do it.
We played a season, I suppose would be an apt way to describe our sort of shorter campaign of Changeling the Dreaming, run by the GM Patrick, who you may recognise from the older episode we did about art in RPGs. It was set in Berlin in '92, which was a great setting for Changeling itself. It got us thinking about the wider kind of applications of this game and the wider themes that run through Changeling, as opposed to some of the other games in World of Darkness like Vampire or Werewolf, and we just figured it's the sort of thing that is not as well heard of compared to Vampire. I think Changeling doesn't have the same kind of reputation, and it's probably equally as interesting to discuss both mechanics wise and in terms of the concepts that it tries to put forward.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that we're not just going to sit and tell the listeners about our game of Changeling and what happened in it and who our characters were. And if we touch on that, it will be very brief. Really, what we want to talk about is, as you've quite rightly said, you know, the mechanics of Changeling, how it differs from Vampire, maybe why it was less popular, or is it less popular? You know, what you get from it. So the game in general is what we want to talk about. So don't worry, we aren't going to regale you with 8 weeks of Changeling plot or anything like that.
Yeah, it's going to be a broader discussion. So Changeling the Dreaming itself, why don't you tell us a little bit about the kind of idea about what the game is and who the player characters are?
Okay, so I think it's going to be interesting to go back to the genesis of Changeling the Dreaming when we talk about this. So there's a very brief history lesson. A lot of people will know this already. Mark Reinhagen, who was responsible for Vampire the Masquerade, worked with a little company, or had a little company called Lion Rampart, who was responsible for Ars Magica, which is a game where you played wizards in the 12th century in a kind of pseudo-mythic Europe. And there were fairies as part of that whole Ars Magica game. You know, there were divine and, you know, kind of demonic elements, and there was also a fairy element, as the beliefs were, you know, at that kind of time. And when they created what we would call the classic World of Darkness, you know, with the whole Tremere being wizards turning into vampires and everything, Ars Magica was essentially the background to the modern World of Darkness, and was later revisited in things like, you know, Mage the Sorcerer's Crusade, etc., even though it was a couple of hundred years later. But the point I'm trying to make is the kind of medieval version of the World of Darkness was kind of already in print with this game of Ars Magica. And they had the concept of fairies, they even had a fairy source book for Ars Magica. So when Mark Reinhagen was plotting, and, you know, others were plotting out the basics for the World of Darkness, the 5 games they wanted to do, originally they were called Vampire, Werewolf, Mage, Ghost and Fairy, were the original working titles for Wraith and Changeling. You can even see them talked about in early Vampire sourcebooks. They are called Ghost and Fairy. And you even get some fairy NPCs in some early sourcebooks and stuff like that. So the concept of changelings and fairies was always there in the background of the World of Darkness, ready to be explored. But one of the things that Changeling benefited from is it came 5th in the line of the main 5 games. So its predecessors, the aforementioned Vampire, Werewolf, Mage and Wraith, had already come out and set a lot of the concepts of the classic World of Darkness out, so that by the time Changeling came along, there was a lot of work already done, so it was a lot easier to fit Changeling into. So in terms of publishing, you know, it was the last of the 5 major games to come out, but it did have its genesis in the Ars Magica game. So in essence, that's where Changeling comes from. It comes from Ars Magica. So obviously one of the major differences is you're playing a Changeling and not a vampire. So many people will be aware of what Changelings are, but to give you a kind of brief idea, it's a fairy who shares a mortal body with a fairy soul. So it's kind of a hybrid creature, part supernatural, part natural. And I think that's part of what makes these classic World of Darkness games so interesting, that you play what we would call a regular person, and then something has happened to that person to turn them into something unnatural or supernatural.
Yeah, lots of themes of duality that extend through the game and go so far as to be a sort of integral part of the character that you play. Each character has its own duality, which kind of allows you to experiment with a lot of different concepts and clash conflicts internally and externally together, and kind of see how those two ideas develop when they're at odds with each other. Changeling's quite good for that.
Yeah, it is. There's always these great themes of conflict in the World of Darkness games, whether it be Camarilla versus Sabbat or humanity versus the beast and all these kind of things. And with Changeling, we've got this idea of summer and winter, of loss, of rebirth, of bedlam and banality are the two main forces. So, madness and kind of boringness, if you will. The everyday world versus the fantastic, and having to balance these two things in a kind of yin-yang cycle is part of what makes Changeling really interesting.
Yeah, I found as well, with the setting that we were playing in, Patrick put us into 1992 Berlin, just after the wall came down, and the setting itself was full of duality. You've got the whole east and west. Still, it's only a few years after reunification, so there was a lot of tension between the two sides there as well. So there's a lot of, even, you can take the concepts from the game, extend those outwards to a setting of your choice, and still have those same really big picture concepts that are coming into play. And then when it comes down to a scene about a macro level, like for example, there might be a scene where there's some internal conflict going on within one player's head between the mortal and the fae sides. It's really kind of scaled up and scaled down ideals that fit all around the game that are kind of ripe for exploring. There's a lot of opportunity there.
I've always felt that players in general, and obviously I can only judge on the players I've spoke to about Changeling over the last 30 years, that Changeling is approached a very different way to a lot of the other World of Darkness games. Players and GMs and groups will approach it in a much more light-hearted fashion, almost see it as a bit of like comic relief, jokey game. I think that does Changeling a disservice, and my personal view has always been that that's maybe why Changeling didn't get its own dedicated historical game. Maybe that's why Changeling didn't get a huge print run of books like the Major 3 did. There's over 100 source books for the original Vampire the Masquerade, and Changeling manages to top out at like 32 books, which for a regular RPG collection sounds like a lot of books, but for one of the core 5 White Wolf game lines, when these guys were knocking out books left, right and centre for years, 32 books really isn't a huge headcount.
Obviously it comes down to how many does one game need, I suppose. I don't think you could get through 32 Changeling books in games if you tried, but I guess that never stopped them from releasing hundreds more for the other ones.
Yeah, I don't know. I think a good game can support a huge line of source books. I'm just trying to think of other games that have absolutely tons of source books, but you could level that accusation at any of the major games. How many Shadowrun source books have there been? How many Cyberpunk source books have there been? I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but there's more than 32 for each of those. So that a lot of these, BattleTech source books, Traveller certainly, even within their own Traveller ranges, there's a hell of a lot of books. So I think as long as a game is popular and has scope for writers to explore it, there could have been more done. And in my opinion, there was much more that could have been explored with Changeling. As I've already mentioned, it didn't get its own historical book. Obviously, Vampire had Dark Ages, Werewolf had the Wild West, Mage had the Sorcerer's Crusade, and by the time they got to Wraith, they did a Great War source book, but it wasn't a standalone book. And Changeling didn't even get a historical source book, never mind about a standalone game. So it's clear from a publisher's point of view, they weren't going to put that amount of effort and money into a product that they obviously didn't believe was going to sell as much as the other three.
Yeah, did they ever get a 20th anniversary or revised edition of Changeling?
Yeah,
as well?
there's been a C20, and obviously there was a Changeling was reincarnated as Changeling the Lost in the New World of Darkness. But getting into the differences between Changeling the Lost and Changing the Dreaming and talking about the New World of Darkness is another massive subject in itself. So I think we should just focus on Changing the Dreaming, its original incarnation, for now, rather than anything that's kind of come later once the publishers started changing and stuff like that, because that becomes a real sticky web after that.
Yeah, good idea. So in terms of how it plays, you have the same standard World of Darkness storyteller system looking character sheets with the abilities and attributes and all that kind of thing. Where it differs from, for example, Vampire maybe, is instead of the disciplines and the blood pool, you have to control your level of glamour and your levels of banality and keep those balanced.
Well, I think for people who don't play Changeling, it's worth mentioning, you just mentioned glamour. Glamour is essentially the fuel that powers the Changeling's magic system, and it is essentially harvested from humans in the form of kind of inspiration and dreaming, and can also be harvested in nastier ways as well. But I like to look at it mechanically, like almost like vampires taking blood from humans to kind of fuel their powers. Changelings need to harvest dreams from regular mortals in order to fuel their magic, which is cantrips, require bunks to cast, and bunks are essentially magical foci or rituals that are done spontaneously in order to convince and kind of coerce reality to do as you wish.
Yeah, not to the extent that Mage does, but that's another conversation. But there's and again, another duality there between the Seelie and unseelie brands or legacies of Changeling, where a Seelie character who's more stereotypically good would draw glamour by inspiring the mortals around them, and the dreams that the character then creates can be used to fuel their own cantrips, their own magic, whereas unseelie changelings would be more of a ravaging type and taking dreams from mortals, maybe without their consent, in whatever form that might take. We saw some scenes of that during our game that were always hot button points for the episodes. Always hot scenes.
I think it's worth mentioning two things that you've mentioned there. The unseelie and seelie, it's worth noting out that they almost represent the summer and winter of the ever-evolving year. And Changeling does take a lot of these old, what you might even call pagan concepts, these old kind of earth concepts of the cycle of the worlds, and how the world turns. And Changelings naturally the Seelie court would rule in summer and then would hand itself over to the winter court, and so forth and so on. And with regards to the magic system, yeah, you're right, we shouldn't get too much into technically the difference between Mage and Changeling's magic system, but I think it is worth pointing out that I think Changeling's magic system is massively influenced by the work that was done on the superb magic system from Mage.
We love a bit of Mage, don't we? Yeah. As playing Changeling, that was one of the things that I enjoyed the most. In order to cast any kind of spell from a combination of pools that you've put together, where you kind of decide what it is you would like to affect and how it is you would like to affect it, and that any combination of those two things sort of makes up the basis for your particular character's set of skills. And it's kind of up to you then how you apply those two categories in any situation. In doing so, and in casting a spell, every spell requires a bunk beforehand, which is like the ritual or the manner of casting, if you like. And what I liked about the mechanics is it makes sure every bunk has to be different. You can't wave a wand every single time you cast a spell. Every bunk has to be situational or circumstantial, and it really lets your imagination flourish, because no matter what you're going to do, you're going to have to try and justify it to the game's master and to yourself and to the rest of the role-playing group how it's happening. And it's a really good way to be imaginative with the spell casting, as opposed to just saying fireball and sticking your hands out in the air.
Yeah, I think bunks can be really tricky because, um, especially for players, it puts a lot of creative responsibility on them to come up with something interesting before they can cast their spells, and to continuously do that in a kind of fresh manner, doing something different throughout the sessions, and throughout the games, etc. So I think that's why a lot of players could struggle with a game like Mage, and certainly with a game like Changeling. And I think also it's why a lot of people will view Changeling a lot more slapstick and a lot more humorous and comedy game, because it's so easy to fall into the bunk that you are kind of presenting and performing to be humorous and funny and kind of laughable, and that obviously changes the tone of the scene and the game in general. And to be honest, I don't think that's necessarily players and game masters' faults, because I think the rulebook doesn't do a great job of steering you away from doing bunks in different kind of themes and feels. I think it really does push you towards comedy, which I think is a shame, and I don't think really represents the game in its best light, if I'm honest. So I think there's definitely a writing, a presentation issue with that, especially the first version of Changing the Dreaming, when it could have been presented a little bit more darker, a little bit more World of Darkness, a little bit more gothic punk, I think, rather than the kind of slapstick comedy that a lot of people attribute to it.
Yeah, it's very light-hearted, and on a bookshelf it stands out compared to the other four. It's very different in tone and appearance. Is there a version of Changeling that you would say does that the best, that makes it the most serious, if you like?
It's a really tough one, because I think any game is what the GM and the players make it, obviously, but you have to look at the way the writers have written it and presented something in order to get an idea of what is to be intended to be the average game session in that kind of thing. And it's my belief, having read a lot of World of Darkness books and a lot of Changeling, that the original writers for Changing the Dreaming have done it a disservice. I think they wanted it to fit in with the rest of the World of the Darkness. I don't think they wanted it to be the silly younger brother of Vampire and Mage. I think it's got higher concepts, some of which we've touched on. I think it's got real pathos in it, and I think unfortunately they were having such a good time putting this bit of light relief together that they've shown too much of the comedic side and not enough of the dark side. Now, there were source books that touch on that. The Shadow Court and some of the later books will deal with kind of more serious issues, but it never really begins to touch any of the dark kind of areas that you would see in Montreal by Night, or Loom of Fate and stuff like Chaos Factor and Destiny's Price for Mage, which is kind of criminal and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't get into that, unfortunately. So I think Changeling is almost its own worst enemy in that respect, because nobody takes it seriously, because I think the writers didn't do a great job of taking themselves seriously when they were producing it, unfortunately.
Right. So then, not that there's anything wrong with running a game like that, but it's not really where you will get the best out of it, is what you're saying.
No, there's nothing wrong with running any game the way you want to run it, but to me it seems at odds with the rest of the World of the Darkness, really. That's where I get that kind of jarring feel from it, because everything else maintains this gothic punk, dark, mature, almost new romantic edge to it. And I realise that we're travelling through the years before we get to Changing the Dreaming, and everything, the whole where they were going with the World of Darkness was changing, and they were probably getting a lot more customers. Their customer base was becoming more varied and a lot wider. But I still think we could have got a much better version of Changing the Dreaming than we did. And I think for players and GMs who want to kind of scrape the hundreds and thousands and the kind of icing off the top, you will find a decent tasting gothic punk cake underneath if you can be bothered to get rid of all that crap on top.
Great analogy. I love that.
Thanks.
I'm hungry. So again, it's always kind of comes down to the GM and the players.
I think there's loads of people who will want to play Changeling in a fun, slapstick, light-hearted way, and it almost is a primogenitor for that kids on bikes kind of game. You can run around and fight dragons with wooden swords and get into all sorts of hijinks and stuff like that, and get home for tea. It's jumpers for goalposts and all that kind of stuff, isn't it? But I just don't think you're going to get... If you're into the world of darkness, then there's no wonder that a lot of people will just play mage and vampire instead of picking up a changeling book, because they make it so hard to get a gothic punk game out of it in some respects. I mean, the first edition, in my opinion, does a better job than the revised second edition. Second edition becomes a quite dry mechanically in some places, even though it does a better job of explaining some of the bizarre concepts about, you know, different realities kind of meshed over each other. But there's just so much silliness and zaniness in the early Changeling.
Right. Well, our GM did a fine job of filtering a lot of that out, because the game that we played didn't feel particularly zany in terms of our approach to it. But I think that speaks maybe to what we were looking to get out of it more than what's actually in the book, you know.
Yeah, of course. Like I'm saying, I mean, you can get a lot of groups that will take Changeling really seriously, and you can get a lot of groups that will take Vampire not seriously at all. You know, and as long as everybody around the table is having fun, and that's the game you've signed up for, then, you know, that's all great, isn't it? But I mean, me coming from a big fan of those original Gothic punk worlds, then I like to portray my Changeling universe with that feel, with that Gothic punk aesthetic, you know, with that dark, yeah, fair enough, sprinkle it with a bit of Tori Amos, Neil Gaiman, bit of Sandman in it. I mean, that's to me, my main influence for Changeling would be things like the Books of Magic and Neil Gaiman's Sandman and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. That's where I think it sits best, rather than Saturday morning cartoon shit, you know what I mean?
Right, yeah, definitely. I mean, there is scope for kind of darkness and horror sitting in there. If you are interested in the mage magic system, but if you find it a bit daunting, I think Changeling would be a good place to start to get your head around the same kind of approach to what would then go on to, well, what is a more developed version in mage. You have the same kind of approach to it, don't you? When you look at your character sheet to cast a spell, you're really looking at a simplified version of the same things that happen in mage.
Yes, absolutely. So I mean, anyone who's familiar with, say, Vampire, where you have a discipline and it does X and that's it, great, finished. That's dead easy to use in a game. Whereas with Mage, you have mastery over certain elements of reality, and based on your levels of mastery in certain areas, be it time or life or energy or whatever, you can then achieve certain results. But it's very free form. And as Mage developed actually as a game, they had to provide much more ideas of kind of like spells so that you could get an idea. But Changeling is almost a hybrid between those two concepts, where you have set realms, so areas that you can control, and arts, so certain powers that you can cast. And by a combination of casting a power on a certain thing, you will get a certain result. So it's a lot more constructed than the mage system. But you're right, it still requires a level of creativity from the player. That's something like disciplines or even gifts from Werewolf does not require from the player.
Yeah, I found it a lot of fun, to be honest. The interacting with the magic system, figuring out what spells to cast and how to cast them, that was my favourite part of playing this game. That appealed to me the most. And if I have to build a character again for Changeling, I would be looking at the magic system, at the realms and the powers, and thinking about what's going to be the most fun, what's going to be the most applicable to the kind of game. It was really where a lot of the mechanics came to life the most, and where they flourished the most was in those moments. And watching other players think up bunks on the spot, or having bunks and rituals prepared in order to cast whatever spell they were casting, it really kind of... those are the key memorable moments from the Changeling experience that I've had so far.
Yeah, I think it definitely rewards the creative and imaginative player, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that for a lot of individual players and maybe groups in general, that's a much harder thing to achieve, and that can really stilt a session, you know, that can really stop it in its tracks while people have to, you know, figure out what to do. And Changeling did offer, you know, kind of standard bunks, and you know, they were even like they produced a card set to go with the original game, which obviously they didn't think was a great idea, because they kind of got rid of that halfway through first ed before second ed. But you know, they originally produced kind of cantrip cards and bunk cards, where you would draw a card from your deck and it would tell you kind of what you had to do, or what little ritual you had to perform in order to cast your spell. And bearing in mind, these rituals were quite often as I've said before, comedic or kind of slapstick in nature.
How much do those cards go for now? They're hard to find.
They're hard to find sealed, but I think because the Magic system, it's just so difficult to play with the cards, they don't have a lot of appeal in terms of people wanting to get them, because they would just be for diehard World of Darkness completionists. I can't envisage. I own the cards, and I can't envisage sitting down playing Changeling with the cards.
Right.
I would always probably play without the cards, and even as early as the Changeling, the Dreaming Player's Guide, and the book itself, they're offering dice alternatives to the cards. I just think you got to remember White Wolf. They were a company. They were up for making money, and if they thought they could spin out the Magic system into people buying booster packs of cards, so to speak, which were kind of blind packed. You've got to remember this is the height of the CCG craze in the gaming industry as well. So, White Wolf have already had massive success with things like Vampire the Eternal Struggle and Rage, which was the CCG for Werewolf, the Apocalypse. So putting cards into packs and selling them wouldn't have seemed like such a bad idea at the time. But I think obviously in retrospect, it didn't do the game any favours. They learned that pretty quick and they changed pretty quick. But they're beautiful cards. They were produced really well. They were larger than the standard trading card format, so they were kind of longer. So I don't know what the format they're called, but anyone who collects cards will know those kind of much larger and longer kind of rectangular cards, and they were heavy card stock. They were beautiful quality, and I'm sure, as I said, sealed boxes of them and stuff will probably fetch a reasonable price to collectors. But it's not a thing that you would rush to collect because there's not a lot of use for them,
Yeah, well, yeah, as you said, I couldn't imagine playing this with cards anyway. The appeal to me is that freeform aspect, so having something dictate to me how to do it would completely remove that whole idea.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it's the game you want to play, isn't it? It's how you want to do it, really.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think as I've said there before, there's a lot of players who can't think on their feet that fast, who do want help in what do I have to do to cast this spell? Well, do whatever you want, and that's great for a creative player, but for somebody who's not that fast, you just go, oh, well, I don't know what to do, and before you know it, the scene has kind of stopped, and everyone's, oh, well, just do this, and it kind of makes sense to have something to fall back on, but. Yeah, and I don't want to make it sound like I don't like the Changing Magic system. I think it's great. I think Changing as a game is overlooked by a lot of players and groups. And what I'm more saying about scraping bits off it and changing it and whatever isn't because I don't want people to play Changeling. It's because I want people who may look at Changeling as just a funny slapstick game to give it another chance and to look behind that curtain and peer into what's behind it, because I think there's plenty of stuff there, the meat to get into, that could really challenge a group who are interested in playing a lot of those other World of Darkness games. And I think if you can play that more traditional kind of almost Brothers Grimm style fairy tale game with Changeling, or take it in that Timothy Hunter Vertigo Comics kind of direction for people who are fans of fables and stuff like that, I think that Changeling could be a really good vehicle for that. And for people who like playing classic World of Darkness, then Changing the Dreaming it is a savable game. Don't write it off.
Don't write it off. All right, that's a good conclusion. I think don't write it off. It is worth playing. It is savable. And I mean, I had a lot of fun. I like the kith, the character classes, if you like, or the races. There's a lot of good inspiration to be drawn. They lean quite heavily into Celtic mythology and Celtic kind of terminology. There's some good elements to it that I think I haven't seen in any other kinds of games. So it's an interesting tome, definitely.
Yeah,
and it's a lovely stained glass front cover artwork as well, which is always nice. Unrelated to Changeling the Dreaming, you have been reading Changeling Earth. I figure what best to move on to than something with a very similar name.
Beautiful segue.
Thank you.
Couldn't be more different. So I've just finished reading the second of the Changeling Earth books by Fred Saberhagen. People may not be intimately familiar with Fred Saberhagen. He is one of the lesser known Appendix N authors. Obviously, most people will know what Appendix N means, but the the fantasy books, which were the inspiration for Gary Gygax and Dungeons and Dragons. So, alongside Lovecraft and Howard and Moorcock, etc. These were published in the very early 70s and are a classic example of kind of swords and sorcery and technology combined. And what I really enjoy about Fred Saberhagen's Changeling Earth books is it is set in what I think to be a kind of massively changed North America, many thousands of years after some form of Third World War or apocalypse, and I think that kind of idea would have really struck a chord with writers and readers. You're looking at Cuban Missile Crisis times and nuclear threat and Cold War and all that kind of stuff. The idea that we could destroy Earth and make it a blasted wasteland, and people would have to, drag civilization out of it over thousands of years, would have been an interesting concept. It still is. So what you have with the Changeling Earth is an America that is, elements of technology lie buried and kind of hidden and to be rediscovered, and society has kind of returned to an almost feudal state with kind of warlords ruling vast tracts of land, and peasants eking kind of living out of the land and stuff like that. But one of the interesting things Saberhagen does is to make the technology that we are familiar with, be it a tank or a helicopter or whatever it is, he's very overt with what it is. So rather than play the teasing game with the characters finding a transport or a thing that they don't understand, and we are very quickly as the reader given the idea that this is a tank, and I quite like that because we would guess it already very quickly anyway. Any reader would. So Saberhagen's very good at letting the reader know exactly what this is, but then the pretense and the illusion continues for the characters, and that's quite enjoyable because you don't have to follow the character's idea about learning what this thing is. You as the reader already know, and especially in the first book, there's quite a large part of the plot is about kind of resistance, rebel fighters finding a thing which they call the elephant, which is actually just a tank. It's a very modern tank, and cool. There's some lovely scenes where the guy who discovers it has to figure out how to open it up, and then when he sits inside, the tank kind of comes to life, and buttons start to flash, and a heads-up display drops down, and he's kind of, figuring out how to use this tank, and ends up, riding around in it and causing all sorts of amazing trouble. But it's very overt, and I think quite often with these books that are set so far in a future Earth that it's become kind of feudal again, the technology is given in really gentle or subtle hints. But I think Saberhagen just says, fuck that, I'm going to give you tanks, I'm going to give you helicopters, and I'm going to give you all sorts of other weird stuff as well. And the other side of this is he puts in demons and wizardry, and he puts in all that real Conan sorcery stuff as well. So you have these kind of evil warlords who are in command of, demons and jinn and stuff who are literally, supernatural entities. But then you also have weird bases with, medical helicopters flying around inside of them and stuff. It's a real juxtaposition of ideas. And it to me, anyone who's read Moorcock can get a lot from Saberhagen, because it's very easy read. The concepts are very understandable. Heroes are heroes and villains are villains. Nothing's too complicated, but there's some really interesting and creative concepts in it, and I've thoroughly enjoyed reading I'm going to read I've just started reading the third one. And it's much of the same. I think the three books in the Changing Earth series were obviously written all just to go together. They're quite short. They could easily be packed into one book, one large book. I believe Saberhagen is more famous for doing the Berserker series of novels, but I haven't read them yet. But I was more interested in reading the Changeling Earth books due to Goodman Games releasing the Empire of the East source book for their Dungeon Crawl Classics game, which is based on Saberhagen's novels, which I've just been talking about. So I'm going to really get stuck into that Empire of the East source book when I finish this third novel. And it's going to make me dust off my DCC rulebook, which I've had for a long time. And, I've played a little bit of DCC, not huge amounts, but this definitely is going to get me back into playing DCC, I think.
Awesome. Any excuse to play in a game where I can drive a tank and shoot at a dragon?
Do you know what? It makes me remember a lot of the really early Dungeons and Dragons stuff, and I'm talking like, kind of very early years of Dungeons and Dragons. Wasn't afraid to put in these kind of sci-fi concepts in with your regular fantasy. I mean, you only have to look at Dave Arneson's Blackmoor and stuff like that to see, crashed spaceships and renegade robots, being kind of hacked at by barbarians with two-handed swords and stuff. And
awesome.
Yeah, and it really surprises me that the regular D&D and AD&D rule books, especially the early ones, AD&D first edition and stuff, doesn't have more of the that sci-fi element in the book itself, because so many of the stories and writers from Appendix N and so many of the adventure modules written by some of the early writers like Gygax and Arneson and stuff have this kind of they're not afraid to put sci-fi elements or kind of modern elements into their games. I'm really surprised it didn't creep into the rulebook. And I mean, I know we have Gamma World and Metamorphosis Alpha and Omega and stuff like that, that kind of covers that sci-fi element, but they weren't D&D, so it really blows my mind that there isn't more of that in the original, when it's clear that the writers and creators of D&D were being influenced by so many different stories which involved kind of future Earth.
Yeah, I mean, we see that stuff a bit later on with things like Spelljammer and Planescape and that kind of thing.
I mean, we do and we don't, because, I mean, Spelljammer came along a little bit later on. It was a concept that was explored in a few kind of early adventures, but as a campaign setting in its own right, it came along in AD&D second edition. But that's more D&D in space. It's not really D&D sci-fi. So Spelljammer just takes all of the fantasy concepts, like wizards and swords and stuff like that, and takes them into space. It doesn't really turn into, ray guns and, faster than light ships and robots and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't really do that. So in a way, that's not the kind of influence that I'm talking about with kind of Saberhagen and Gene Wolfe and, a few of the writers who clearly have set their stories on an Earth where we can, if you dig down deep enough, you can find the remnants of 20th century technology, and to all intents and purposes, it would look like magic because you wouldn't understand how it works. And there are some great articles in early Dragon magazines and other gaming magazines about how to include modern or even futuristic weapons and stuff in your fantasy games, but it never really creeps its way into the core rulebooks, which I find a bit odd. I mean, obviously it's a decision there that they didn't want to just maybe, I don't know, confuse people too much, or they just wanted to stick to the fantasy. Obviously, I don't know the reasons behind that, but as I learn more and more about Appendix N, and as I pick up more and more really early D&D adventures and books, it really surprises me that it isn't in those main rule books, when it has been put back in with D&D 5th. One of the things that really surprised me pleasantly about D&D 5th when it came out was that if you look through the core books, there is every opportunity there for you as a GM to put in muskets or even laser guns, jump packs, stuff like that, to bring back that idea that you can put that sci-fi element into your fantasy games right there, right at the beginning, not in a source book, in the core books. I just think that was such a really good move.
Cool. I mean, I don't know about you. I prefer my genres separate for the most part, but I understand what you're saying. It's nice to have that versatility available to you, but unless I'm really specialising in something, I tend to prefer my genres separated. I like either fantasy or sci-fi, and if they mix together, it's got to be real good, like a Gene Wolfe thing.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that. I can see both sides of that. I like that mixing of that genres, that kind of swords and technology kind of mix. But more about whether we like it or not. What the surprise to me is when I start to explore more Appendix N writers, there's a lot more of that than I initially thought there was.
Right. So
I'm surprised at how much it hasn't influenced very early D&D. That's kind of my surprise, that a lot of it is really just core fantasy without the kind of sci-fi elements.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get back to Changeling Earth.
Yeah.
Why is it called Changeling Earth? This is something I wanted to ask you about. Where does the title come from? Is it just because the Earth has changed due to the incident of the war, whatever it might be, or?
Well, I mean, Changeling Earth is the term that's given to the trilogy as a whole, and it's the first two books are called The Broken Lands and The Black Mountains, and they are geographical regions in which the story takes place. The last one is called Changeling Earth, and I've only started the third novel, so if there is a reason why we find out it's called Changeling Earth, I haven't discovered it yet. But they are referred to as the Changeling Earth series. But I'm assuming there's something like that. I mean, the reader's already been informed that the events are taking place on the Earth far, far in the future, where our own civilization has been wrecked. But yeah, as I've said, that there's loads of supernatural elements in it. So whether we may find out what happened to the Earth in this, we may not. I'm not really sure. There's plenty of these things where you read the novels that are set in a future Earth, and they either don't discuss what happened to Earth, or that discussion comes a lot later, you know.
Yeah. And this Empires of the East book that you mentioned, is that directly set in the world and is a licensed product, for example, or is it just kind of influenced by?
It is indeed a licensed product. So it's an official,
cool.
Saberhagen kind of take on it. It's set pretty much, I mean, you can do what you want with it, but I think it's designed to be set when the kind of first novel starts, because that you can either choose to get swept up with the events of the novels or not, as you would decide. But I think the events of the novels themselves will change the background to a degree where it might not be as fun to play in. And I guess you can see a lot of that with things like Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. I mean, you wouldn't choose to play after the end of the War of the Ring, would you? Because it would be a little bit boring. You'd probably choose to play kind of just at the beginning of the novels, because then you can go and explore all of those things in it. But it does a really good job of, I've looked through it. I didn't want to read it cover to cover. This is the DCC source book, because I didn't want to spoil it myself for the novels.
Right.
But I did have a look through, and obviously it stats out some of the major NPCs and the idea of the demons, and gives you that kind of technological idea. It messes with the magic system a little bit, just to make it suit the kind of Changeling Earth books a little bit better. Provides some adventures, gives you details of geography and the areas which are talked about. So I mean, for fans of DCC in general, or for fans of Fred Saberhagen's novels, it's a go-to. It's not something I was intimately familiar with. It's allowed me to go back and explore a section of the Appendix N, which I wasn't necessarily familiar with. So for that, I've been really thankful for it, and I think it's a real feather in the cap of Goodman Games to put their money where their mouth is, and to support and provide a book which really goes back to the roots of that kind of 70s D&D, which was the very beginning of DCC. That's what they were about. And I can do nothing but respect that. I think that the fact that they are continuing to do a deep dive into the roots of D&D and provide it for DCC, and it's similar to, I've forgotten the name of the writer now, but similar to the guy who did The Chained Coffin and other stories, which was based on the Appalachian weird tales of Manly Wade Wellman, I think. Which is another Appendix N author, and DCC, was a box set and then a hardback book. So I think, DCC are doing some really, really cool stuff. And, I kind of ignored them for a little while, because I got into it when DCC was, was coming out and it was all the rage, and, and I played quite a bit of it. The whole idea of the 0 level funnel and stuff like that, I really enjoyed. But then I kind of put it to one side, and this Empire of the East book has really made me look at DCC in another way, and made me think, there might be more value in this game than I've kind of set it aside and not played it. So I think it's going to go in my playlist for this year. I think I wouldn't be surprised if I end up playing some DCC this year.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, listeners, keep an ear out for that. There'll be some games advertised for you to try and join in the future. Tell me a little bit about the art direction. I mean, I love the covers for these books. They're so surreal and abstract and cool. But as well as Empire of the East 2, just kind of describe it to me about what it's kind of depicted as.
What do you mean, the DCC source book?
Yeah, the whole universe. What does it look like? But particularly.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, the 3 original paperback novels have really weird ass covers on the front, so I don't think they really depict anything. But in terms of visuals for the DCC source book, as much as I've just raved about how good it is, the cover is by the amazing Ian Miller, who, you know, Games Workshop and Warhammer fans will know very well. It was commissioned especially for that book, and is a superb piece of art. The art direction inside is just regular DCC. It's not something I massively enjoy, if I'm honest, but I just think, you know, the writing and the content is great. You know, it's not bad art. I'm not going to say it's terrible. It's just a little bit more cartoonish. It's just regular. Unfortunately, the book isn't full of like amazing Ian Miller art. You know, I would love it if it is, but I mean, it isn't. And the cover is fantastic, but inside is just kind of stock DCC material, you know. I mean, it's drawn specifically for, you know, this book. It depicts things that are in the Changeling Earth books, but yeah, it's not, the art isn't going to blow you away inside.
Right. We're here for the content and the words, aren't we, more than the art?
Yeah, I mean, the cover does a good job of attracting you to the book, I guess, which is its main purpose. But after that, the art inside it ain't bad, but it's not, you know, it's not mind blowing.
Okay, all right. So if I was playing a game of this and I was a group of PCs, what would be the kind of typical maybe starting adventure or scenario that I might find myself on in this world that would be unique to the Changeling Earth compared to anything else?
I think the default setting would be the players would be heroes in what they call the Free Peoples. So the people who are fighting against the tyranny of the Eastern warlords, who kind of rule their lands viciously and cruelly. You know, soldiers in black armor who are strode out to destroy farms and all that kind of stuff. And I think you would play pretty much the resistance fighting against these kind of Eastern warlords. But what makes it different would be obviously playing in what at first would appear as a fantasy setting. You know, humanocentric to a degree, but there are some other intelligent races. But you would be playing a fantasy game with, you know, with swords and shields, but then you would very quickly, or you should as you're playing this game, discover some old tech which would, you know, really change things up a little bit, and it wouldn't just be like playing a regular game of D&D, you know, whether it is a helicopter or a tank or a jeep, or you find a cache of machine guns or laser guns or whatever it happens to be, or even weird artifacts that you have to figure out what they are. That's what would make it feel very different to a regular fantasy game, and that's what makes it a little bit more, you know, a little bit more Appendix N, a little bit weirder, a little bit more kind of weird tales, you know.
Yeah, very cool. Well, speaking of weird tales, I finished the second Shadow of the Torturer book, Claw of the Conciliator by Gene Wolfe, which is in very similar kind of vein to the Appendix N past future kind of themes that we've just been discussing. I liked it, man. I thought it was really good. I thought it was very different to the first one, more expansive. I don't know if you remember these first two books particularly well.
I do, yeah, I do.
Yeah, I thought. I mean, I love a book that gets trippy towards the end, and as Claw goes on, it starts introducing these little subtle hints, much like how we were talking about earlier. Whereas Fred Saberhagen would be more overt with his ideas and references, this kind of thing is very drop a hint and then move on, and then as the reader you're like, what was that? Sorry, and you've got to keep reading to kind of find out what's going on. You've got to put these pieces together yourself a little bit, and as it goes on there's these more strange visuals and weird things happening, and there's a lot of kind of, is that really this tech, or am I really, is what these characters are interacting with really what I think it is? Are there really spaces between dimensions? Is this really faster than light travel? Are people really in outer space kind of vibe? It's very bizarre, but towards the end it gets really trippy, and I really like that. I think it deserved, after one book and then 3/4 of the next, it kind of deserved to go a little bit wilder with itself. And the second book ends on an expansive note where it just makes you want to go and read the third one. So I guess he did that really well. I guess that's the idea, right? Yeah,
I think with Gene Wolfe there is a lot more. One of the major differences I would say there between him and this Changing Earth season is there isn't a lot of that overt sci-fi in Changing Earth. There's none of it, essentially. You know, there is no spaceports and spaceships and, you know, laser guns and all that kind of stuff. It's almost as if it's more Planet of the Apes in its post-apocalyptic nature than anything else, if that makes sense. You know, it's kind of like modern. You're more likely to dig down into the ground and find, you know, a New York subway than you are to find, you know, a broken spaceport or anything like that. So I think with the Gene Wolfe stuff, it's so incredibly further in the future, and you know, it's a whole different take, which I really like. But especially the first novel, you can get a real sense of it just being a kind of regular dark fantasy novel, and these elements creep in. And I really like about that, because that's a slow parting of the curtain. Whereas, as I've said there before with Saberhagen, he just gives you a tank and it's done. I kind of, even though I've enjoyed that, I prefer the way that Gene Wolfe teases you and kind of provides you with a lot of stuff that's head scratching, and but it's done in a much more mature kind of. It's a lot more detailed, and it's a lot more real, and that's why I liken Saberhagen to Moorcock, because it is what it is. You're not meant to take it massively seriously. You're just on for the ride, and it's just the enjoyment. Whereas I think with Gene Wolfe, there is the sense of this deep, living, breathing universe that you're following a character through, and that's what I really get about Severin and you know, some of the other characters there. They don't exist in a void, you know. The events that are happening on this earth are not all just happening here in front of you. There's just a tiny little snapshot of what's going on, which I think is superb. I think Wolfe's writing style is brilliant.
Yeah, it does a really good job of world building, which is an art form and something that I'm a big fan of, seeing done well in books. There's a lot of little elements that add together to make the whole of the world that you're reading within, and there are a lot of whether it's a landscape or the way he lights a scene or a particular character someone meets, it all kind of adds together to give you a sense that there's this bigger world that people are existing within. You know, I think it's not until the end of the first book, or I only really got a decent picture of it in the second book, that he describes that the sun is dying and the light is red and the days are not very bright. Now obviously that's the staple of the setting that he's done, but not knowing that, when I was reading the book, I didn't get a sense that that was the case until near the end of the first book, where he describes the red light of day or the red light of the sun, and you just think, oh, sun's red, right. And then, you know, maybe 2/3 of the book past that, someone else mentions that the days are the light of the day is not very bright, or whatever it might be, and it's a real slow reveal. You know, the moon is green because of the agriculture that took place there, and now there's like mysterious forests on the moon, and then the light of the moon is therefore green at night time. All these little things when he just says the word green moonlight, and then you don't figure out until later on in the book why the moon is green. Just lovely little kind of sprinkles of world building that go into it. I particularly liked, as a quick example, there is a scene where he's in a village, I think it's near the start of the second book, and a gentleman is advertising in a similar way that you'd advertise like a freak show or something, that he's captured a green man from the wild, and if you pay some money you can go and see the green man and he'll tell you your fortune. And our protagonist, in desperation looking for another character, decides to go and test out the green man, see if he can divine where his friend has gone. And he goes into this little tent where they keep the green man, and it's a gentleman whose skin is like the colour of pale jade. And through the conversation he learns that this green man is from far distant world in the future, where the race has eliminated the need for food or drink, and they live by algae that lives in their skin, that he refers to as pond scum. And only by the bright light of the new sun is the green man and his people able to survive, because they are like solar powered future humans. But to our protagonist's eyes, he's like, you're insane, that's crazy. But you know, just reading the words as the reader, you're like, Jesus Christ, there's like, what world is this where this is going to happen? You know, he's talking about a different sun here, and this guy's time traveled back in time, and it can't exist in the fading light of the old sun. And then, you know, he that's a chapter and he moves on. Hopefully it'll come back in a third book or something, but just as a little kind of encounter, it's the perfect little world building thing, because from one conversation you just get so much imagination, and you're really inspired about what this world could be, and the past and the future. So it's about space and time, and he covers all that ground very succinctly. I think he does a real good job with the world building.
Yeah, and that's just Wolfe using this character as an excuse to expand both Severin and the reader's knowledge about the wider reality, if you will. You know, the walls outside of the guild. Are just, excellently done. You know, you're on a journey of discovery with him, and that's what I think is, if you can get that right, that slow reveal that you're talking about. I mean, that's the way to do it, isn't it?
Absolutely. So, I had not really made my mind up after finishing the first book. The second book was, I'll give it a try, and after finishing the second, I'm fairly confident now. I want to at least go a little bit further. I don't know how many of these books there are. I'll try at least the next two, and then I'll see where that takes me. I would like to finish this kind of tale, but I don't really know how many books there are. Let me just have a look. Just going to look this up and see what I'm getting myself in for here. 4 volumes in the Book of the New Sun. Okay, I'm going to do all 4, I think. There are 4 volumes. Perhaps there are more that go after that. Yeah, there's other works in the same universe, but this is a tetralogy, or a series of 4. So I think I'm going to make a dedication to finish the next 2.
Strong.
Yeah, I've got to round it off now, man. I'm a fan. I hadn't made my mind up after the first one, but now I'm really enjoying it. So maybe when I've finished books 3 and 4, I will return for a full kind of look at the whole franchise. I'd like to get one of those nice fancy copies from the Folio Society as well, because they do some really good, pretty hardbacks. And I know these books have got some great versions, so I'll try and pick up a fancy version if I can. And
then you can get yourself a copy of GURPS New Sun Sourcebook and play some GURPS and Gene Wolfe's creation.
Mate, bit of GURPS it up. Yeah, definitely. Be a journeyman of the Guild of Torturers.
You know, all that jazz. Lovely.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so a bit of GURPS on the table. That could be my first GURPS rulebook.
It's expensive. Start saving.
Alright. Cool. Okay. Yeah, that's good. We'll get back to that. Do you remember on our? It was one of the times we were speaking to people on Skype. I think it was with Ari, and we had finished a Suspiria review, and we were talking with Ari about the style of Giallo films from Italy.
I do. Yeah, I do remember that.
Yeah. Well, coming off the back of that conversation in the Discord, we were talking about the Giallo genre of Italian films from the 70s, and Ari pointed me in the direction of some little kind of RPG kind of adventure books, toolkit books. And they looked intriguing enough and cheap enough for me to pick them up. So I brought them on here to tell you about, because I know that it's something that interests you a little bit as well. So I have with me here the 3 post-mortem Giallo books by Post-Mortem Studios.
And where can people get these, and how much are they?
So you can visit the website post-mort.com to pick up the PDFs. The hard copies are available on Lulu, which has all kinds of RPGs. Mostly it's trash, but there are some gems kind of hiding within the piles. So if you want a hard copy of these books, you can head over to Lulu. I think they're about £7 each, and there's 3 of them. So nice and cheap, print on demand. They're little soft back. They're very thin. You know, you can pinch them between your thumb and forefinger. They're very thin books. But for the set of 3 and for what you get in them, I'm fairly happy with them, and they look really nice. They're these bright yellow covers, typical of the genre. Giallo, of course, meaning yellow in Italian. They feel really nice. The covers are kind of almost rubbery covers. I don't know what option that is on Lulu.
So why is this? Why is it called Giallo then? I mean, I know you said it's yellow, but what does that mean for the genre? Why?
Okay, the origins of Giallo began in, I think it was 1929, when an Italian publishing house started making translations of classic detective mystery books from Britain and America. So we're thinking about Raymond Chandler, Agatha Christie, I think it's like Edgar Allan Poe. So these classic books that were taken off were brought over to Italy and translated and released with these yellow covers from this one Italian publishing house whose name escapes me at the moment.
Yeah.
So it was as early as the 30s.
So therefore they've become synonymous with the covers of these books, and thus Giallo has become the term for this. Right, okay, I understand.
Yes. It became this kind of catch-all term for detective and murder mystery books that kind of expanded into its own genre later on. Obviously, it began with the detective novels. If we move forward into the 70s, the 60s, 70s, it became a genre of film. It's the sort of predecessor to the American slasher genre. If we look a little bit earlier, before America was producing the slashers that everyone knows and loves so well, in the mid-60s and 70s, the Italians were doing it in their own fashion.
So by slasher movies in the 60s and 70s in America, you're talking like kind of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and what movies are those that you mean?
Well, like Friday the 13th.
Oh, okay, right, like Halloween
associated
and shit like
sequels. Yeah, proper teen slasher.
Right.
Nightmare on Elm Street, all the classics. Group of horny teenagers go into a cabin in the woods, and then they all get killed one by one by a masked killer who then turns out to be the jock from the start. The real kind of
Scooby-Doo.
Yeah. Scooby-Doo with blood. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Giallo has a lot of those same tropes as a film genre.
So is Giallo responsible for Scooby-Doo? Is this what you're telling me?
I'm gonna say yeah. I'm gonna put it out there and say yeah.
So if you want to play a Scooby-Doo role-playing game, what you can do is go to Lulu and purchase these and get your Scooby snacks on.
Yeah, and just ignore the warnings about sexual violence and exploitation that come at the start, and you'll have a great time.
Bring your ex-cards.
Bring your ex-cards for Scooby-Doo. That's the only Scooby-Doo I want to see on my table.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, as far as the genre goes, these books do a pretty good job of kind of bringing it to life through role-playing ideas and stuff like that.
So are they? Yeah. Is it all right? Tell me about these books then. Is each one a single scenario? Are they system agnostic? Tell me from a role-playing point of view what these products are then.
Okay. They are 90% system agnostic. There is a system that is also sold on Postmortem Studios called Actual Fucking Monsters, which is, I think it must be one of their systems. Their shop is just a ball of madness. I'll talk about their web store in a bit. But for the most part, it's system agnostic. Each book is very slightly related to the other one, but any of the three could be used by themselves is the idea. Mm-hmm. They contain NPCs, locations, the odd random table, which I always love. Not enough random tables, if you ask me. And plot hooks, and kind of everything you would need in a given location. The three of which are detailed in these three books, for a GM to have enough story elements to run a game for a group of players, probably a one-shot or a very short campaign. There's not much in here, obviously, because they're quite thin.
Okay.
I think where I'm purely with my GM's hat on, looking at these books, where they fall flat is there's no table of contents and there's no index. So it's literally just you open it up and it's just words from start to finish. Now, the words are good, there's some tables in there that are useful, but if I want to reference a table quickly, there's no way for me to know where it is other than bookmarking it or bending the spine.
But I assume the page count isn't so large that you probably can't find something very quickly.
No, I am just being pedantic because the page count, they're coming at under 50 pages each, so there's not much to look through. But
So it's not like a 400-page tome where, I really need to find zombie stats and I don't know where they are because there's none of that in there. But so what would be your instinct as to whether to run it using this house system that they've got, or would you adapt it to another system of your choice?
I would adapt it mostly because I'm both unfamiliar and uninterested in the house system that they've got, AFM, Actual Fucking Monsters, which seems to me like a kind of Twilight satire kind of thing, just from reading the blurb. Okay. It doesn't look particularly interesting. So I would adapt it the whole point of these books, just from reading the little kind of intro descriptions, is that they're meant to be adapted. They describe the scenarios and contents within as you can either run them as a hard-boiled detective story, or a psychological thriller, or introduce supernatural elements and occult elements into it. And it lays out these locations and scenarios in the book as saying this can be supernatural if you want it to be, but it doesn't have to be. So if you want, there can be blood rituals and demons, but it could also just be malpractice in a hospital. It gives you enough to work with and adapt. So I personally would adapt probably all of these to a different system. Let's say if I was going to introduce the supernatural side of things, I might use Call of Cthulhu, for example. It recommends using something with a sanity or a fear mechanic within it to kind of get across that idea of the tension building and that kind of thing, and people's sanity tearing. So,
okay, yeah.
I mean, considering they're small books, there's a lot here. And if I take the first one as an example, all it does is detail a location, a block of flats, these lofts, like an apartment building, and then all the NPCs who live within it and their relationships to each other. So each NPC has got a 2-page spread. There's one name, and then they've got 2 pages per, with their own history, some of their kind of darker secrets and their backstories, and then what they all think about each other and their relationships with each other, be it romantic or otherwise, they owe each other money or whatever it might be. So just using that, there is enough there to put together something, or drop your players in the middle and let them find out all these people that are kind of intertwined with each other. They've all got their own motivations. The second in the series of 3 is set in a memorial hospital, so there's very questionable and I'm sure problematic NPCs that is listed with various kind of sexual proclivities that aren't particularly nice to imagine, but nevertheless they're listed here, and you can introduce them or otherwise as your tastes may be for your gaming group. But it's very X-rated, very exploitative. There's a lot of I would say cancelable material in these books. They're pretty hot little things.
I really like that, because I don't think there's enough of that at the moment. I think we're in danger of dumbing down and the RPG industry to some degree. So, not that I agree with doing it just for purely shock value either. I don't appreciate that. It can be done in a crass way that has no value. But if something's done and it's got real power, then I'm excited to have a look at those. You sound like you're describing them almost as kind of character piece sandbox games where they're providing an environment and a group of characters, and then you can kind of drop your PCs and plots into that.
That's a great way to describe it. That's almost exactly what each of them are. Yeah.
So, do you think it gets the hef bang for your buck stamp of approval?
Weighing in a mighty between £7 and £8 per, I would say that it does get a bang for the buck approval. Gets the hef stamp.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, I think I've paid more for less. Put it that way.
Right.
I've been known legendarily to pay upwards of £5 plus international shipping for what turned out to be a single D8 table on a piece of folded paper. So, I mean, that was the opposite of bang for your buck, but we won't get into the D8 tables so on pieces of paper right now. Yeah, I just as a quick little set of 3, I think that I'm fairly sure they're like £8 each. There's enough in here for you to start campaigns or one-shots and then have information to lead off and kind of seeds to plant your own stories. There's a lot going on here that you could do. It definitely gets bang for the buck, in my opinion. So
you think, even though I know you kind of mentioned Call of Cthulhu and stuff, do you think they'd be easily kind of modified to stuff like World of Darkness or even maybe Cyberpunk and stuff like that?
Yeah, I don't see why not. Yeah. I mean, the third one is particularly would be very Cyberpunk to do. The third book in the 3 is set in a convent, and there's these 7 kind of mother nuns, and each of the nuns represents a 7th sin.
Nice.
And has a dirty past that is kind of, they're trying to keep secret from each other and from themselves, and they've all kind of hidden themselves away in this convent, and they've all got like like hard drug habits, and they like to plan orgies, and very very 70s Italian style stuff. So you could easily put this into a cyberpunk game, and
Sweet.
with a sprinkle of transhumanism, it would work perfectly. I think that's a good idea. You could definitely do that.
I look forward to picking those up. They're on my purchase list for April.
Yeah, and I might run one of these myself, to be honest. I know we were talking with Harry about that, so I'm very tempted to maybe do a one-shot using one of these and seeing how far that gets. It would, of course, be a very X-rated, very mature game, and I would try and... Because what's the point in doing this if you're going to pull your punches? Do you know what I mean? If I was going to run a game like this, I would make it hard-hitting, because that's what the content kind of asks for.
Yeah, I guess you got to be careful then, haven't you? I mean, we've spent a whole episode talking about the X card and players and stuff like that. I think, as long as you give people a warning and, to kind of let people know what they're in for, I don't know, it's a tricky one. I don't want to go off tangent, but then, just to answer the question very briefly and we'll move on, and this is hypothetical, if you go online or go on whatever and get some players, people you don't know, right? And I'm talking about people you don't know.
Okay.
And you tell them, I'm going to run this adventure. You tell them everything you just told me. You tell them what it is, where it comes from, the fact that it's hard hitting. There's going to be drugs and violence and sex and stuff in there and whatever. Do you then run that game without an X card? Is that what you did? Have you got yourself a license there to run that without an X card? Do you think?
Good question.
And I don't know the right or wrong answer to this. I'm just throwing it out for discussion. What would your instinct be to do?
If I didn't know my players at all before the game begins, you mean? If I had no inkling of who my players might be?
You do not know what the players are. All you've done is be as open as you can about the game you're going to run.
Yeah, I think I'd use them then, just to be on the safe side, to be honest. If I had any idea who my players were, Giallo is... I'll be honest, it's fairly misogynist. There's a lot of kind of... The protagonists are...
Why should that offend a woman any more than it offends a man, though?
Well, I wouldn't want to scare anyone away, put it that way. You're either in for it or...
But you started this saying, if I'm going to do this, I want to do it properly.
Yeah.
And I get that. And, I'm just... And I don't know the answer to this, so I'm not trying to kind of, trick you into the wrong answer. But
no,
I would be, in the current climate of the way RPGs are and stuff, and I would be worried about, even with massive signs going, this is going to be horrible. And then to sit down, I'm just not entirely certain if somebody got really offended and stormed off and wrote a bad post or review or whatever about me about it. I'm not entirely certain me saying I did warn you would be enough of an excuse for the hive mind that is the internet to forgive me for that.
Yeah, no, I think I'm with you on that one, man. I mean, that's why things like lines and veils and the X card exists, is to stop that happening. If you set out your boundaries with players beforehand, I'd probably do lines and veils and probably do the X card for this game. Yeah,
but then to play devil's advocate, to continue to play devil's advocate with this, if you set up, you've got a load of scenes, you've got, drug overdose and nuns and, kind of child molesters and all sorts of really awful things happening in this game.
Of which there are in the books, by the way.
Right, there you go. So, I mean, aren't you almost kind of, and ideally nobody does touch the X card and whatever, but you're almost waiting for somebody to do that, aren't you?
Trying to get through a scene without the scene being stopped by a player.
Yeah, yeah. I just don't know if. I guess what I'm getting to now is the RPG community in the industry in general, has it reached a place where I realistically not can't but shouldn't run a game like that with people I don't know? I just shouldn't even bother, even with all these checks and balances and X cards and stuff. Or is the right answer to no, put these safety measures in place and crack on as you would, and you've given everybody the chance to bow out at any point. Do you know what I mean? I worry about the way that the industry is, that I could have people complain about me even if I warned you.
Yeah, I'm sure that's happened as well. I'm sure that's been the case, yeah.
And with something so kind of, what sounds, I haven't read them, but they sound edgy, right?
Yeah, but then it's not like, "Way, look at us, we're being edgy." It's not like that. It's just...
Yeah, but there is material in there that could very rightly upset people.
100%, yes. There's some upsetting material in here, yeah. You got these safety measures that we use. I think the most important thing for me would be to make sure, if I was going to include something horrible, that it would be relevant to the story. Not just have it in there for the sake of it, not just have it in there for shock value, even though that's what part of the genre is. It's shocking images, shocking sounds, shocking colours. But to make sure that if I was going to have a doctor who, for example, has some quite bad habits that, with his patients, whether they're conscious or unconscious, that kind of thing, which is all listed in these books, you would make sure that it's relevant to the story, or that there is some element of balance to be had. You have to take the good with the evil. So doing it for the sake of it would be a bad storytelling, in my opinion. If I was going to push the boundaries, as it were, you want to kind of make sure that there's a reason for you to do that, and it's not just gratuitous for the sake of being gratuitous. So you're right, I wouldn't do it and pull my punches, but I would also make sure that the players are on board from the beginning, and that they're aware that there are a lot of themes that could be explored. And as well, I think that comes back to the lines and veils thing. If I say to my group of players beforehand, are there any things you absolutely don't want to see in an X-rated game? Because X-rated covers a lot of ground. There's a lot of things that are mature and adult themes. So if someone takes one away, I've still got 23 horrible things left to play with. So I think you've got to find that balance with your player group. I think that is really important.
Yeah, interesting. And maybe it's just me being cynical and having read a lot of stuff online, and reading a lot of people replying to other people's games and posts and stuff. And I just think we're in a position where if you watched a movie where these things were happening, people would hail it as art. And the minute a GM does the same things, he would be hailed as some sort of misogynistic, twisted, perverted monster. As a person, not as not the game. Oh, this guy's twisted. I can't believe he ran a game with this in, kind of stuff. And then, home, I'll go and watch this awful film and call it high art. I think there's a trigger finger with being upset. That's what would worry me about running that kind of stuff. I'd happily buy it and run it for players I know. That's great, and we've said as much. When you can vet your own player table and everybody around the table, that's a totally different scenario. But I just worry that we're not in a position where I can run anything like that for strangers anymore. I'm just not entirely certain I'll put myself in the firing line like that.
No, exactly. That comes back to what we were saying on the previous on that Valentine's Day episode, where I said, well, if I was going to have a game that needed X cards for strangers, I just wouldn't run it in the first place. That would be my approach. And it does come back to that, doesn't it? Really.
So then maybe what we're saying is, if you're going to run that, you're going to have to run it for people you know.
To an extent, that's the safest way to do it. Yeah, because if we look at the film analogy you were talking about, there's a step removed from the director. The director's never on screen, but if I'm running an X-rated game, I'm looking you in the eyes and telling you this stuff, so you're a step closer to the person who's kind of directing it, if you like. There's not that one step removed from that you are from whoever wrote Hostel or Saw or whatever. You don't have them describing it to you, and you can hear the tone of their voice. So because you're one step closer to the story being told and to the storyteller themselves, I think there is that kind of tendency to maybe have an element of blame involved, or.
But do you not think? I mean, I've got a ton of the old Ionis Games Cyberpunk Night's Edge source books, right, which are kind of horror source books for Cyberpunk, and we're not going to get massively into it now. I think there's a whole other episode in it, but it's relevant to this conversation because some of those adventures are printed adventures, not stuff I found on the dark web. This is stuff that's printed by Ionis Games, licensed by Art Talsorian, sat on the shelves in game stores and was sold to gamers, right? So mainstream stuff. And it talks about rape and abuse and, domestic abuse and, or incest and all these kind of really, really triggering, awful things.
Mm-hmm.
But then I'm the GM. I didn't write this. So I'm not... Isn't that the kind of whole director thing? It's like, well, blame the guy who wrote it, not blame me. And I'm not saying that's right. But then if I run that game and people then have an issue with it, do I not go like, well, the guys at Art Talsorian licensed it. I mean, should you not be sending your complaints to them? And then they could go, well, no, you read it, you decided to deliver it, kind of thing. I just think it's so difficult because I wouldn't run those Ionis Games modules for people either.
Yeah,
But obviously, at some point, people have is what I'm kind of trying to get across. At some point, people have sat down with those books and ran it for people. And there's an argument that we live in more enlightened times with the X-Card and Lines and Veils and all this kind of stuff, which is great. And I think anything that does anything to avoid an awful situation is a win. But it just kind of makes this. It surprises me that some companies, especially, well, maybe it's because they're small companies, are brave enough to publish stuff that pushes those boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's surprising to a certain extent. I had a new context for this publishing house when I went on their website and looked at their other stuff, because they're definitely courageous to a certain extent, because a lot of it looks fairly bad. I think it's a hard question to answer, because at the end of the day, the blame can go around in circles. You could blame Night's Edge for having that material in it, and then you write a complaint to Night's Edge, and they could blame the GM for running the game. So there's no one answer. You could pass the blame around like a hot potato all day long, really, if you want to look at it like that.
I just think that it's a really dangerous line, because we're now in a position where several creators have been demonized, and rightly so, for their behavior as people, and the work that they do, whether it be RPGs, fiction, or anything like this. But then, where do we draw the line about separating out material that is misogynistic, because it's just material, it's fiction, and can we then assign that level of misogyny to the creator because he has effectively thought about it and put it down on paper? It's a real tricky situation.
It is definitely tricky. It's the same as, for example, if I was going to run a fantasy whaling game and I have my players play whalers, that doesn't mean that I'm not an animal rights advocate. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean that I care about animals and that I haven't eaten meat in however long because I'm concerned about that in real life. It's just in the game.
Yeah.
There are themes that I want to explore where I have humans killing animals. So I think obviously it's probably a weaker analogy, but you get my point.
I do.
There is a separation between the person and the story that they're telling, and I think to confuse those two is to make a quite a grave mistake when it comes to RPGs.
I couldn't agree more, but I feel as a community we're slipping into that, potentially.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I mean, it'll be interesting to see where things go and if they come back around. I mean, at some point, maybe the pendulum will swing the other way, and we'll be back to a point where everything is super extreme and horrible and offensive now. And you think, well, people have their own kind of ideas. Society changes. You never know what's going to be perceived in 5 or 10 years' time. Like even one of these books talks about mental illness in a way that is quite demonizing, and I could happily argue that the case for neurodiverse people not to be treated as antagonists purely because their brains don't work like everyone else's. So there are elements I don't agree with. I'm not even saying that I agree with everything that's presented in these books either. That's another thing that I should stress. Some things I read and I go, I wouldn't even touch that. I don't like that. I don't like how it's presented to me. I don't like how it would feel in a game. It wouldn't feel right. So it's full of all kinds of that kind of stuff.
So it's a bit of a minefield, really, is what you're saying.
Yes, for me and for the players, yeah. But well, I don't know. If you had time to plan it out, then you could plan a story in which you were comfortable with the elements that you were using, no matter how X-rated they might be.
It's just tough, isn't it? Because in one way we're kind of supporting this module and we're saying, it's good, it's well written, you should pick it up and play it. And in the other way, it's going, nah, there's stuff in here I wouldn't do. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, is this stuff good or is it not? That's the tricky thing. There are bits of it that's good. That's the tricky thing. So I guess I would just hate to think that we're gonna big this up and then somebody's gonna buy it, get mega offended by it, and then go, well, you guys said it was good, so you guys must be, drug dealing, kid touching misogynists. Do you know what I mean? You're absolutely right that there should be a distinguish between like art and fiction and reality, but those lines are blurry, aren't they? Yeah,
and maybe someone pressed stop and they stopped listening to this podcast 20 minutes ago when we were just talking about the good bits, and now that's their impression of Hef. Because that has happened, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe they haven't waited around to see what the summary of this discussion is. I mean, yeah, you don't know, man, but it's one of those things. I would rather address it either way, and bring it up in conversation and be wrong and have someone give me something to learn from, than just kind of stray away from it altogether. If listeners, if you are listening to this and you disagree with this stuff, then hit us up on the brand new email address that I've created, humanenergyfieldpodcast@gmail.com, and send us your thoughts. If you think that we have learning to do, then let us know. We're open-minded about this stuff. It's something we want to learn from. I understand it's a minefield of a discussion, but yeah, like I'd say, I'd rather have the discussion and bring up these things and talk about them than just go, oh, it's got that and it has it, never mind, and just push it away and move on. I think it's, whether we like it or not, maybe isn't the conclusion. The fact that it exists and that, like you're saying, the community is going one way, whether that's a worry or not. It's about the stories you want to tell, and if you want to have an homage to this 50-year-old film genre where women were treated very differently and there was lots of blood and exploitation, and that's what these books are for.
Good conclusion.
50 years, eh? 70s was a long time ago, man.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad stuff in the 70s.
There was a lot of bad things in the 70s, that's right. Okay, moving on. Throw those over my shoulder. Let's talk about a film. For the film segment, we are going to be discussing the 1999 supernatural drama Bringing Out the Dead, starring everyone's favourite Nicolas Cage.
What a guy.
What a powerhouse of an actor. What a craftsman. A creative singularity. There's been some great talk on the Discord about Nicolas Cage recently. I didn't think that the Jazz Musician of American Actors would spark such heated discussion and extended metaphors, but apparently that is the case. So there's been I've been chatting with some great people on there about kind of his approach to the craft and his approach to directors and how directors would utilise him, which we're going to get into now. I want to attribute that quote. I found the source. David Lynch was the person who said he's a jazz musician of American Actors. Nicolas Cage himself has described his acting style as nouveau shamanic.
Wow.
I love that. It's great. I mean, what a guy, right?
That's my next Shadowrun character.
Yeah, the nouveau shaman. Yeah. Bringing Out the Dead is a Scorsese film, which I didn't realise. Features Nicolas Cage in a starring role as an unhinged paramedic. I mean, he's got to be unhinged, hasn't he? Unhinged paramedic, or in the US, I think they're called EMTs or something, EMSs. I don't know what the Americans call them. Who we follow him and various partners across 3 nights in Hell's Kitchen, which is a great setting for paramedics on the night shift. It's really kind of evocative. There's a lot of encounters going on. The film kind of plays out over these 3 nights, kind of like a string of various small scenes, one after the other. They take various calls. I think they take about 3 or 4 calls a night, and each one is various scenes put together. They go to wherever it is that's happening, deal with whatever body or horrible thing they've found, come back to the hospital with said patient. There's always an encounter at the hospital, and then he comes out of the hospital, probably lights up a cigarette or meets a recurring character, and then the radio's calling again, and before you know it, they've got to get back in the truck and back off out into the streets. And that's pretty much the whole 2 hours, is this kind of this pattern of work. Each of the 3 nights he rides with a different colleague. So we start off seeing him with John Goodman, of all people, riding shotgun. The second night, it's Ving Rhames in what may possibly be my favourite Ving Rhames role I've ever seen him in. Absolutely great performance by Ving Rhames. And the third night, the last night, with the always underrated Tom Sizemore playing this kind of wacky, anarchic paramedic who's like almost got this kind of bloodthirst. It's a very bizarre film, especially considering it's Scorsese, because it has these kind of esoteric undertones. There's a little kind of supernatural element to it. He talks about Hell's Kitchen having more ghosts per square foot than anywhere else in the world, and this kind of thing, which is not something that I I'm used to hearing from Scorsese. Whether there's a relationship between the fact that this is the only film featuring Nicolas Cage and Scorsese, and the only Scorsese film of the 90s to not receive any Oscar nominations, I'll leave up to the listener. But overall, I think it does a really good job of kind of cycling through these nights, and we just watched Nicolas Cage begin kind of on the edges of on the edges of his own kind of breaking point, and then we just slowly watch these events unfold. He gets a little bit more kind of unhinged and a little bit more kind of closer to the edge, and he can't sleep, and he's making himself IV drug cocktails to keep himself going and all this kind of thing. Scorsese does a good job of keeping the reins on Cage for the most part. He's not allowed to get too jazzy with his acting, but when there are those moments and when he does raise his voice and wave his arms, it has more impact. It's character driven. We know that it's happening for a reason. It's not completely out of context like it might be in some of the Nick Cage films, where you just kind of, he's like an outlier compared to the other actors around him. You know, in this film, when Nicolas Cage is Nicolas Cage, it kind of makes more sense to me anyway. He does a really good job of playing that like boiling point. You know, he's got these big purple bags under his eyes. He's just got this like simmering kind of tension going on. White knuckles on the steering wheel. He just does a really good job of like portraying this kind of just madness. And
it's worth pointing out that I haven't watched this. I didn't find the time to watch it in anticipation of us recording this, but I have seen it, and it was out of a conversation that we were talking about Nicolas Cage, as we often do, and I mentioned this movie, which I'd seen, probably then. That it's probably when it came out was when I watched it, so that's probably how long.
99.
Yeah, it's, right. Or around then, like the year after maybe, or very soon to it coming out. I remember it being newish. So it's been a long time since I've seen it, but and again, obviously talking about it, and now you talking about it is bringing it back to my mind. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you talk about the kind of esoteric elements, because I have this nostalgic feeling about the movie that I was almost watching this kind of almost Dante-like descent into hell. This kind of circles of hell, purgatory kind of sense from the entire thing. And there's the idea of these nurses or paramedics or whatever as potentially angelic figures, or as maybe fallen angels, and the absolute horrors that they're surrounded by. Did you get that kind of feeling for it? Am I kind of maybe waxing nostalgic on it?
I think you could pull that out of it, definitely. There's definitely a kind of, I think because the scenes change so much, and the only constant is the hospital that he goes back to every time, and that's where the nurses and the doctors are. I think you could maybe draw those parallels with that kind of angelic side of things. And every time he leaves the hospitals and goes out on another call, the color palette is different. There's a lot of film effects. There's a lot of bright lights, red lights, and there's a lot of things that are shot in shadow. And he talks about ghosts a lot of the time. So yeah, I'm sure you could draw those parallels to it. Definitely, yeah. But some of my favourite bits of the film is when he comes back to the hospital with a fresh patient, because it's like absolute chaos there every time. If that's what American hospitals are like, then I really pity our cousins, because it just looks like absolute mayhem. And they even talk about, we can't accept any more patients right now, we don't have the funding, and all this kind of thing that to our English brains is a completely foreign concept. But what I liked about it is that every single character is individual, whether that's the junkies that are strapped to the hospital beds that he walks past, or any of the doctors or the nurses that he meets in the hospital, or his paramedic colleagues. They're all individually written. They all have their own kind of quirks and traits, and I didn't feel like any character was boilerplate. Like I didn't feel like any of them were template characters. So that was really good. Even if they appear for 10 minutes on screen tops, they feel realised. I don't know how much of that was Scorsese's doing, but it's as a character piece, it's really interesting to watch all these different kind of personalities clash with each other, and they're all there, trying to save the city, I guess, in their own way.
I don't want to be guilty of dragging everything back to RPGs all the time, but very briefly, can you see any value in this? Could you adapt this to a scenario? Do you think would this work as a kind of episodic game? Do you think could you do something with this? Because my thought instantly goes to like cyberpunk trauma teams and stuff like that. Like could you do this almost this dark character piece where you get the players to play the crew of a trauma team and just send them out to pick up shit and kind of almost get back to bases, back to the hospital and stuff. Can you see that?
Mate, absolutely. Whenever I watch a film for this podcast now, I always try and look at it through that lens, and this film lends itself very well to that kind of thing. And I even found myself thinking about halfway through how good this would be set in a dystopian cyberpunk world, playing a trauma team. That's a thought that I had watching it, because he goes out into Hell's Kitchen and it's kind of established as this kind of lawless thing where there's a subplot about this drug which is killing people on the streets, and people are living and dying for this one particular kind of heroin cocktail. Michael K. Williams plays a gunshot victim. So there's another character from The Wire as well. Sonja Sons is in it as well. So there's some good Wire cameos. But yeah, absolutely, man. I think it would work best as maybe a 2 or 3 player game where you could have 3 players in the ambulance or the hovercraft or whatever you want to do. And it gives you a real solid concept to say, you guys, you're all trauma team or you're all paramedics. Your mission is to help this person and bring them back. It's a very solid concept. There's no grey areas there. You know what you're doing. You know what you're in for.
All right. Okay. Well, I'll declare it here on the show. I'll run that.
Amazing.
I'll run that in May, one shot. I'll put it out. People can email us through the new email that you've just given us, humanenergyfieldpodcast@gmail.com, or they can hit us up in the Discord or the Instagram, whatever. I'll do maybe 3-4 players. I'll have a look at it. I'll dig out the Cyberpunk 2020 book. I know the system already. I'll rewatch this movie and I'll run that session. I'll run that session in May for people, for a few little hef listeners, whoever fancies it.
That'll be a blast, man. I might even crop up in that game. I don't know. I don't want to miss that one. You have to let me know how it goes.
Cool.
Yeah, it would lend itself very well to that. So give the film a watch and get back to me on that. But it's perfectly suitable in terms of tone and in terms of execution. Things you'd have to do. Yeah, exciting.
Well, I know we mentioned last episode that we were thinking about doing some stuff, and if you might look at this Giallo, I think this is, I want to get a reason to jump in and start running at least one a month, and I think so for May, there it is, Down with the Dead Men.
Amazing. Keep an eye for that one, guys. Join the Discord, Human Energy Field. Join the Instagram @humanenergyfieldpodcast, or send us an email now, humanenergyfieldpodcast@gmail.com. I also put our episodes on YouTube, so maybe you're listening to this on YouTube now as well. So if you don't have Spotify or Apple or any of those things, you can find our stuff on YouTube. We share it with your friends as well. So we try and get out there a little bit more. And stay tuned for updates on how Jamie's Trauma Team game goes, maybe in a month's time or so after he's running. I'm really looking forward to hearing about how that one finishes off. That sounds really cool. So we'll skip over the music segment for this episode, but if you're interested in Giallo as a genre of the films, then you can check out the Italian progressive rock band Goblin, who performed some soundtracks for Dario Argento and some other kind of Giallo directors. A very kind of discordant prog, in your face, bright and colourful metal. Not bad. Warhammer time.
Warhammer time.
It's Warhammer time, baby. Thank you for sticking with us this far. We announced on our previous episode our new Warhammer project, Forges of Nothos, and all of the ideas that came with it, whether it's building an army list or building terrain, or more recently in our case, writing fluff and building history. That was the most recent update that we've got in terms of how this project is going. Our armies are built. If you want to hear about the armies that we've made, go back to the last episode, check that out. We're setting our little project on this planet, and we decided if we're going to have any kind of gravitas, the planet needs a full and rich realised history that stretches back for millennia. So that's what we did.
We did. We used a microscope as a vehicle to explore these ideas. And what I really want to do very quickly before we jump into the background of Nothos and what we decided and what we discovered, can you just tell us what Microscope is?
Microscope is a fractal role-playing game, or as you called it, a structured conversation, where a group of players together collaboratively creates a civilization, a timeline. So using the rules laid out in the book, which are very simple, you can very quickly, within 20 or 30 minutes, have a full realized timeline of a civilization, full of unique events and all the kind of complex web of interconnected incidents that occur. You can watch this civilization rise and fall, and there's high moments and low moments, and you kind of, together as a group, build what will become this timeline for your chosen empire, planet, business, corporation, civilization, universe, galaxy, whatever you've decided to do. It's a very versatile little book.
And obviously what we did was take the concept of Microscope, but we had it within the framework of the 40k universe. So we already sat down with the idea that we wanted the here and now to be pretty much the Warhammer of 3rd edition. So we didn't want to worry about Primarchs and all that kind of stuff, Primaris, sorry, and all that kind of stuff, or even Primarchs. We don't want them wandering around. But so I think we kind of 3rd edition time is, kind of 13th Black Crusade, that kind of, 3rd War Armageddon, all that kind of stuff. So we decided the here and now to be modern, pretty much 41st millennium. And obviously we had certain universe time anchors. So the Age of Strife and the Horus Heresy and things like that. And, everything from mankind's history, which you can find in most of the 40k rule books throughout the eras. So we had a backdrop already, didn't we? So we already knew, we came to the table knowing Nothos was going to be a Forge world. We knew we wanted it to exist now. And then that allowed us to then start piecing the story together.
Yeah. And if you're starting from scratch, which I recommend because it's an absolute lot of fun. It's a great pub game now that the pubs are open again. Part of the setup for the game is that you, together with your group of players, set rules for what you do want to see and don't want to see in the world. So you each are allowed vetoes. We want to do it in space, but then another player says, well, I don't want any aliens, I want only humans, whatever it might be. So there's ways to set up the game, but we were able to skip over that step because, as Jamie says, we were doing it entirely in the 40k universe. So a lot of that is already pre-established, and we knew kind of from the get-go the contents of the world that we're building within. And we also had ourselves a little timeline to reference with everything from M1 or M10 up to M41, which helped us to kind of visualize whereabouts this planet was going in terms of its history.
Yeah, I think when you've got that timeline and you can pop the Horus Heresy straight in at M30, 31, and then you can kind of go back to the Age of Discovery and all that kind of stuff and the Age of Darkness. I think you've got really strong anchor points there for your history to kind of bounce off.
Yeah, it's great. It's a lot of fun. And since writing up the results of our game as well, and taking a more in-depth look at the timelines that are available on Wikipedia and seeing all the little kind of extra sections of the Age of Apostasy and every event in the Horus Heresy and this kind of thing that you can get hold of on the Lexicanum, tying those into the events that we had written up was also a lot of fun, having everything align perfectly. For example, there's an event in our timeline where we decided the very last seas of the planet Nothos had dried up now after the Forge Worlds have taken over. And as a result of that, collectively during play, we decided that would be the same time when water cults sprang up and the worship of the Emperor as a water god would begin. Now I had this timeline in front of me, and typing it up into a document to be shared, which you'll be able to get on the Discord soon enough, I referenced it to a Wikipedia and found that the same time we'd written that was also when the plague of unbelief was spreading across the universe, when cults were springing up in the 40k world. So it actually made perfect sense. It was after the Age of Apostasy. Our own little cult that we'd created in our game was actually almost directly during pre-established canon. So that was quite rewarding as well to see that kind of come together.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I threw in there, and I really wanted, as we were saying last episode, I really want to get into some of these religious ideas and, you know, the various ways that people can worship the Emperor or other powers. And I think, you know, whether it's heresy or not, and obviously by the ecclesiarchy and stuff it would be viewed as heresy, but to kind of look at the Emperor through different lenses was something I really want to get out of this Nothos project, whether it's from, you know, my True Sons of Rus, or from your sisters, or, you know, from the population of Nothos itself, whether it be in the past or now. I just think it's a really interesting way to look at this kind of divine being.
Yeah, there's so much scope there to figure out kind of how other people would see him, and how, you know, we were talking about the Emperor and the Omnissiah being dual deities, weren't we? Like the Emperor being the life giver of the water god, and the Omnissiah, because he's left all these tools of destruction around this abandoned planet, being seen as the death to the Emperor's life. Yeah,
I think obviously with Nothos being a forge world, the Omnissiah obviously would be well known. At one point there would have been whole, you know, legions of tech priests and Skitarii and all this kind of stuff, and to have that idea of the Omnissiah as that Grim Reaper, that technological Lucifer, if you will, that kind of master of the physical dark material, and the Emperor as this ethereal kind of water-based life giver, you know, this shining god. Do you know what I mean? And you can totally see how people would fall into worshipping one or the other, or both, you know. And we came up with some really interesting imagery, didn't we? You know, kind of the Omnissiah with a Grim Reaper and all that kind of stuff, and the Emperor with like a trident, you know, kind of that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a really interesting vehicle to just explore some of that weird kind of cult and religious. And Warhammer's great for that, isn't it? I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah, there's plenty there to work off, but none of it is ever explored to the extent that you'd like it to be. It's kind of referenced and then not detailed. So Microscope is one great method to kind of take a closer look at that and decide what directions you want to go with it, and set up the timeline of history for the world that you'll be playing on. So it just puts a lot more context behind it. You know, we had that, you put in the Razor Wars against the Dark Eldar that were, even though they were 10,000 years ago in the timeline, now if you're playing and there's Dark Eldar tech lying around, you've got context for why that's there. It's a real great way to just kind of pepper your worlds with information.
And I think that's one of the amazing things with having it in the 40k universe. You've got so many toys in the toy box to play with.
Yeah, definitely. You know, we're just pulling all sorts of stuff from thin air and out of different codexes and rulebooks and things like that, and just throwing them in there, having it all fit together. I think Microscope would also make a good solo project if you were going to work on a book, for example, something set in the past future, like we were talking about, or whatever it might be, and you want to have that civilization established. Microscope's a great way to do it, so I recommend that book.
But with regards to Nothos itself and the Warhammer campaign, I think what it allowed us to do was to think further about where these battles were going to take place, how we could structure our campaign, maybe what the terrain was going to look like, ways for us to factor in potential new armies and allies. So from that point of view, it really allowed us to establish Nothos as a location that would realistically accept pretty much any of the forces you would know from 40k to be fighting on it. By the end of it, we decided that the Forge world, the Forge factories had sucked Nothos dry as a planet entirely over, you know, tens of millennia, and due to technoviruses that had kind of spread out, the population was absolutely decimated. And so there's only a minor kind of population scavenging through the remains of the factories, and the Imperium has pretty much written it off, right? So we decided that obviously it still owns it, but there is no longer an Imperial governor. There's no longer an Arbite kind of fortress stronghold. You know, there's no PDF. There's no Imperial Guard garrisons, anything like that. It's effectively being signed off as a dead world.
Very, very grimdark, very metal.
Which allows us to maybe set our games in and amongst huge, almost citywide factories, which some of which may still be pumping away, and some of which have probably been broken down centuries or millennia beforehand. And you've almost got this underclass of scavengers who've been kind of tearing bits off factories and rebuilding machines for millennia. This kind of tech savagery, which is so prominent in 40k imagery. We've got so much of that there in Nothos because we wanted to provide a backdrop which would not only be great for tabletop wargaming, but potentially for some role-playing episodes and other kind of wider stuff, maybe Inquisitor games or skirmish games or whatever. And I think we've already managed to put in some elements of the background to the planet of Nothos where we could probably get away with playing some Necromunda or some Confrontation or some Inquisitor games, as well as the small 500-point third ed 40k games, which are going to be the focus of this Nothos campaign.
You mean 54mm Inquisitor, right?
I do not mean 54mm Inquisitor. Don't even get me started on 54mm Inquisitor, right? Because I'm going to put this out here right now. So there's nobody played 54mm Inquisitor. If you did, A, you're lying. B, come on and tell us about it, right? Because I guarantee you didn't play much of it, and if you did, I bet you didn't have much terrain. So because nobody was going to go out and scratch build 54mm terrain. Don't get me wrong, I'm joking a little bit. I know a few people did, and I remember a table being in GW. Yeah, I remember GW Newcastle having a really small table. But the problem with it is once you'd built kind of one setup, that was it. You were never going to rebuild it in another way or anything like that, because it was such an unusual scale to build at. You couldn't... Having all of your terrain and boards and backgrounds and vehicles in 28mm just meant it was so hard to even kit bash stuff for 54mm. I mean, there was some great options there, all in metal, like weapon sprues and arm sprues, and it was kind of a creative gamer's dream to that degree. But trying to find the stuff in retrospect is almost impossible. And I remember playing 28mm Inquisitor when Inquisitor came out, and I think a lot of people did. Play Inquisitor with the models that you had.
Right.
And the inquisitorial range wasn't quite what it is now, of course. I mean, there were Inquisitor models, Demon Hunters and stuff like that, and you could always kit bash. But those 54mm models that were produced, some of them are lovely. And I mean, people tend to look at those models through rose-colored glasses because some of them were shit. I mean, the Pucer and Genestealer especially is awful.
Yeah.
And some of the human models were pretty terrible. I mean, some of them were lovely. I think it's Battle Brother Artemis, the Deathwatch Marine. He's brilliant. Lovely dynamic pose and all that kind of stuff, and big chunky piece of metal. But apart from seeing a display table in GW back in the day, I don't know anyone who genuinely played a lot of games in 54mm. People bought the models and maybe painted one or two of them, but I don't know anyone who genuinely played Inquisitor in 54mm.
Yeah, well, I don't know about genuinely, but I played a few campaigns of it, but I wouldn't call myself a genuine player at that age.
Well, I mean, did you have you had 4 models, right? You had an entire warband.
No, I think it was 1 or 2 each. It was
right,
me
okay.
and 2 others, me and my brother and our mate, and we had maybe 1 or 2. We couldn't afford that much,
Yeah, but I mean, there is part of the problem. They were quite expensive,
Of course.
So I mean, that to me is far more than a lot of people. That's far further than a lot of people got. When I speak to people back in the day, they were like, "Oh yeah, we bought some, but we never really got around to playing because we didn't have terrain." And you want to do books on the dining table and fight your models around that. Then nothing wrong with that. That's great. But I didn't see a lot of people playing Inquisitor 54mm like they would play Necromunda or like they would play 40k.
That's the thing, isn't it?
With fully painted armies, so to speak, in brackets, whether it is 2 or 3 models and actual terrain and stuff, because they set themselves up with such a difficulty with that 54mm scale, man. Like,
not the best marketing idea from a marketing standpoint.
No, there are some for kind of 40k enthusiasts and collectors. There are some interesting Inquisitor story modules. I believe there was 3 of them. I can't name them off the top of my head, but they were kind of like small staple bound expansions for Inquisitor, which there wasn't a lot of printed material for Inquisitor, apart from the Exterminatus magazine. But these 3 kind of they depicted a kind of plot, like a location and a plot and kind of story seeds and stuff, and there were really interesting insights to the kind of things that the writers assumed Inquisitors would be getting up to and arguing about, because they were so far removed from mass tabletop style scenarios, but rightly so, you know. And they can be quite expensive now, but I'm sure people can find them on PDFs and stuff like that. But if you look to find the 3 Little Inquisitor story expansions, they're well worth a read for people who like that kind of Dan Abnett style stuff. You know, there's some cool stuff there.
Awesome. I think it would lend itself well to what we're putting together on Nothos as well. There's enough catwalks and archaeotech and hidden vaults and mutants and heretics going on for the right mix to bring in that idea, you know, whether it's a role-playing game like we've mentioned or 28mm Inquisitor or whatever it might be. We've hopefully set up enough different story points and hooks for pretty much anything to happen within this little kind of environment that we've made.
Yeah. So yeah, you're right. There's rich soil there. Well, not on Nothos anymore. It's been irradiated, but there is rich gaming soil there to be sown.
Yes. So I'm going to finish typing up my Nothos geography and ecology, and get it up on the Discord as well as the timeline, and you'll have some little reference documents. I've also written some fluff about my Chaos Sisters of Battle Army that I'll share with people. It's really great on the Discord already to see the people who are on there building armies and stuff. I think our mate Steven said he wanted to put something together anyway, but having this going on just gives him great context and a reason to do something. So, even if you had other plans anyway, it's just nice to have a tie-in or a reason to do something, and you feel like you're maybe taking part in a little campaign. Whether or not we're in other countries is besides the point, but it's a great reason to pick up some models of anything you like, scratch build some stuff, write a little bit of fluff, and kind of join us on what we're doing.
I think it's worth pointing out as well that even though we're providing this little timeline, it is so wide open for you to come up with any reason why your kind of force or whatever could be there, whether you are Tyranids, Genestealer cults, any chapter of Space Marines, whatever you have. We have detailed various events, but there is literally thousands of years of time, as well as a pretty effectively unowned planet. So no matter what force you've got, check out our timeline and slide your own little piece of fluff right into it, like a reverse Jenga. You know what I mean? Just imagine we've got just this skeleton of the history of Nothos, and if you want to come along and say your cult or your army or your cabal or whatever it happens to be is on Nothos or has been on Nothos for this reason at this time, come on, slide it in there, and we'll build this patchwork Nothos together as well. So you've got a framework there, but feel free to come in and add to it.
That's what it's about, isn't it? That's what it's about. Amazing. Well, thank you for listening, guys. I hope that ends on a high note for you all. Do get at us if you've got any questions, if you disagree with the Giallo conversation we had earlier, or if you want to talk about Inquisitor 54mm with Jamie, or anything else that has piqued your interest, then hit us up. I've got the Instagram, Discord, and Gmail that we've mentioned. As always, thank you very much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure to have these conversations and to hear some feedback about things. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good night, ladies and gents.
Stay hydrated.